Right, good morning, Greg. It's been a fascinating start to the day. We were preparing for a chat about the SDR, our fortnightly podcast, and then all of a sudden, Operation Spider's Web, this amazing Ukrainian attack on what looks like four strategic bomber bases from the Russian Federation. And it does appear to have been what I think might prove to be the biggest single effective attack, the game-changing attack by Ukraine in this war. What's your first impressions of it all?
Yeah, you're right. As we were all waiting for the review to be published, this, of course, has happened in the news. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised at the timing with Ukraine and Russia about to meet in Istanbul, literally as we speak. This perhaps couldn't have been better timed from a Ukrainian perspective. So there's the strategic impact that this is going to have potentially on the perceptions about the war. But you're absolutely right. This, as an event, as a loss of aircraft, although we're still seeing the reviews, if you like, coming in now from some of the intelligence analysis, is huge. And the Russian strategic bomber force is a real sense of pride for Russia. You know, it's the thing we often see off the coast of the UK, causing mischief in the airways. So to lose these types of airplanes is both a military hit and a really quite embarrassing psychological hit as well.
But we probably get into the specifics of that. It's part of it. But first of all, this is a war of words. There is a lot of false narratives out there. So first thing, and whenever I see stuff like this, I'm going, right, cautionary note, what are we actually looking at? Although the Russians claim that they've shot down all the drones, it's very difficult, I think, to quickly make up the sort of footage that we've been seeing. I've got some available. We'll run it as the podcast is running. It absolutely appears as if these were some of the big strategic bombers, the Bears, the Backfires that were sat in the open, 1,500 miles away from Ukraine, probably with a sense of, oh, they'll never be able to get us here. And therefore, how confident can we be that this attack actually took place? And also, how much of this do you think is an air of just complacency on the Russian side? I mean, some of them actually flew out there, didn't they, to get away from the front line? So was this all part of Ukraine's plan to herd the Russian fleet to a position where they weren't protected and then could attack them with impunity?
Yeah, well, according to Zelensky, this was about a year and a half in the planning, and they have clearly done their homework. They knew what targets they were going for, where they would be, and where they perhaps felt they could create an even greater impact. They've been forcing Russia to move these airplanes around. It's almost like a shell game where Russia's been trying to either hide them, which is difficult to do. These aren't small aeroplanes, or put them as far away as they possibly can, Siberia, up in the Arctic Circle, in the belief that they can't be reached. Well, of course, they can be if you park your drones in the field next door. And I think what's so sort of almost, it's like a brand of the Ukrainian way of doing business here. They make sure they get video footage of it as well. So either by innocent bystanders who just take video footage and put it on social media, or they ensure that they publish some of their own footage to really make sure that people will believe it. And of course, as you know, these days, it is relatively easy to get commercially bought satellite imagery that is good enough to be able to interpret. And I've been watching it all this morning that can see that we've got damaged aircraft on the pans on Russian airfields. So they have definitely succeeded. How successful, we'll have to wait and see. But quite frankly, one aeroplane is a huge loss. If it's in the tens or 20s, then we're talking something really quite significant here.
And that's what I think, for me was they're talking about over 40 aircraft. Now, how many of those were scratched versus, destroyed? But I think it is worth getting under those numbers a bit because, first of all, you and I both know you don't buy more aircraft of that than you need. They're quite expensive assets. There's a huge amount of spares. Some of these aircraft have been around for a few years. So now the basic numbers, these are probably going to be dissected, but there's about 55 Bears that are on the books of the Russians, about 55 of the Backfires on the books, and about 22, I think, of the airborne intelligence. The real issue here, I think, is when you and I were flying, you may have had 100 tornadoes, but how many of those were actually serviceable? How many of those were available? And it was generally around about a third of the number. It's also, if you did, as the Russians are flying them away from their home bases, it's very likely that the flight lines where these attacks were conducted actually represented the only serviceable bomber fleet that the Russians had. And therefore, if that's about a third or a quarter of the total numbers, and Ukraine has taken out about 40, that's not a quarter of the operational fleet. That's almost all of the operational fleet. That has profound implications, not only for Russia's use of air power in this war, but also about its own national security.
Yeah, and you can either do that by counting airframes, which is clearly happening now, and you've just done some, fag packet numbers there. You're right. If these were on the flight line and had recently moved to these air bases, then they're the serviceable ones. They're the ones that were, the more prized and precious ones, because they're the ones that have been given all the spares. These airplanes don't get made anymore. So what tends to happen is you cannibalize the older, less serviceable airplanes in order to keep some of them flying. And it could well be in the numbers that you mentioned. So, this could be worse than the 34% that's being quoted, if indeed it's attacked, the ones that have been flying. Where we'll see the difference over the coming weeks is if there's less cruise missile launches against Ukraine, if there are less Russian Bears flying up and down the coast of the UK or in the Indo-Pacific, we'll know that there's been an impact because Russia will now be husbanding its assets. There's an important thing to remember here as well, and this is the bit that perhaps not everyone will understand. These aren't just the aircraft that are being used by Russia to attack Ukraine. These are a critical part of Russia's long-term strategic nuclear plans as well. And this will hurt them far greater than just having an impact on their ability to strike Ukraine. This is really cutting to the very center of Russia's nuclear capability. And that, whilst that can be quite dangerous as well for other reasons, this is going to hurt Russia, and it's going to hurt it for a long, long time.
One thing that struck me about this is that Zelensky, as you said, reckoned it was 18 months in the planning. Reports suggest the Americans went, we didn't know they were doing this. We'll never know what goes on behind the scenes, but it feels like these sorts of attacks have to be intelligence-led. Because, first of all, you need to know where the Russian assets are. You also need to know when they're at their most vulnerable. You also need to know what defences are available there. And also, ideally, you want these aircraft when they're full of fuel and. So how much do you think Western intelligence might have played a part in this particular attack, given its strategic impact? It's not just about Ukraine. It's also about Russia's threats to the Western world. And we're talking on the day that the SDR is being announced.
Yeah, that's a really, really important part of this debate. I think Ukraine could have done this on their own, and I wouldn't be surprised if they have. You can get commercially available satellite imagery that would have very, very easily tracked the location of these large aircraft. You can't hide them. They're just impossible to hide. And a decent pair of binoculars or a decent camera, you only need to be a few miles away looking through a fence to be able to see these. So unless you're sanitizing all your air bases and all the areas around it, people will see them landing, taking off. Someone can do the numbers. So it's relatively easy to track these platforms and make sure that they're where you think they are when you send in your drones. I think Ukraine will enjoy the fact that this demonstrates they can do it without Western assistance for two reasons. One is we're still fighting and we can do this. And secondly, it allows them to do this without the West being implicated. Because if Russia thought for 1 minute that the West had been involved in taking out, a significant proportion of its strategic bomber fleet, they're going to be quite upset with anybody who's helped them. So that's something to watch over the coming hours and days. But I think the really, really clever bit here, and if the timing has been done deliberately, then this is the clever bit. Zelensky is saying to the likes of JD Vance and Donald Trump is that you keep acting as if we're losing. Well, watch this. Because if this is losing, then bring it on. Because this is a real kick in the backside of Russia. And I think Russia, I think they videoed their negotiating team arriving at Istanbul last night to a barrage of questions about what's been going on. I mean, for all we know, they didn't know because they weren't told. And indeed, the Russian press today is playing up the stories of the bridge collapses. It's keeping very, very quiet about this for obvious reasons. This is embarrassing.
Well, I can only imagine what President Putin is thinking, as you say, in terms of national prestige and in terms of instruments of, combat air power. These are significant. They're, as you say, they're a sign of Russian might. I'm going back to your point about America. I do think it's interesting that a lot of the media have picked up this fact that, we're not out of the fight, we're not losing. It's undoubtedly audacious. It's undoubtedly amazingly innovative, and it's asymmetric. But do you actually think it will change the course of the war? What impact do you think it will have on the grinding war of attrition on the front line?
Well, one of the dangers of taking this type of an action, if it really stings, and I think it probably will sting, then Russia's going to retaliate. And there's a lot of people saying, right, that's it. Russia will take the gloves off. Well, they've had the gloves off for a while. So the idea that Russia can somehow up the tempo or do something, more damaging. And of course, we're then going to start crossing other thresholds, heaven forbid, the nuclear threshold. So, everybody here is watching to see how this plays out in terms of that escalatory battle. So it could have an impact there. I think it is going to stop Russia using these platforms and thinking very, very carefully how it protects them. So that could give some respite to Ukraine from some of these cruise missile attacks, which will be a good thing because it will be able to husband its air defenses accordingly. So it could have a tactical impact. I think there's another angle to this as well. I mean, everyone's saying as if, this is a new paradigm. It's a new way of fighting. Russia got attacked in Syria by drones. They had aircraft, strategic aircraft, destroyed or certainly badly damaged in Syria a few years ago. And you and I know that you go back to the Cold War, you go back to the Vietnam War. If you leave aircraft in the open in a line, they're vulnerable to anything. They're mortars, hand grenades, people running up and down with machine guns. Drones are just another way of doing this.
Do you think, because the whole asymmetric nature of this, as soon as I heard the news and you went 18 months in the planning, it sort of resonated with the Israeli attacks on Hezbollah, didn't it? Where the walkie-talkies that wasn't just a spur of the moment, wake up one day, let's go and do it. There was a huge amount of planning involved. And if the videos are to be believed, you've got these sort of Arctic containers lorries parked near the airfields with false tops on, with these command centers and remotely operated. Apparently each of these 117 odd drones, each of them remotely piloted, and that is an immense operation, and it does appear to be a growing part of the Ukrainians' USP. They attacked the Kursk bridge. They've been using these drones at sea, knock out the Moskva and other capabilities as well. Do you think we're going to see an increase in these sorts of asymmetric attacks, long-term planning? Do you think that's where Ukraine sees the potential to break out from the tactical impacts and start to have a strategic impact on the war?
Well, yes. I mean, I think if you look at some, I've wondered whether some of these drone attacks in the past haven't been done by drones flown locally as opposed to flying 1,000 kilometers, because it's relatively easy. These drones, you can put them in the boot of your car, reassemble them, fire them out of a clearing in the woods and be gone. And what's the one thing nobody pays any attention to lying around airports and shipping ports and towns? It's shipping containers. Or trucks carrying shipping containers. So what are we going to start doing? Searching every shipping container on the road. So it's an incredibly clever way of getting inside an enemy's sort of defenses. So we talk about all these sophisticated air defenses to shoot down systems. And then you forget the shipping container parked just outside your fence line. But of course, we shouldn't underestimate that Russia do this too. Undersea cables, fires occurring in DHL, storage areas, aeroplanes mysteriously, with packages on board. So the asymmetric way of fighting is probably, well, it is on the increase, and I think we might see more of it. And of course, the danger with that is a lot of people call it the grey zone, but it's this way of fighting that doesn't try to cross a threshold. But you are at war. It just doesn't necessarily feel like a one that you're used to.
No, but I do wonder sometimes, you and I both get involved in some media reporting around some of the stuff, and you think, some of the sensationalism type around it, you go, yeah, it's a great attack, but it's not going to change the course of the war. When they do things like this does feel different. It feels like, the A-50, I said A-10, A-50 earlier, their mainstay, their sort of command control, information gathering aircraft. That is crucial, and they've lost a few of those. I was looking back, there's 2 potentially been lost this year. You don't have that many anyway, and your serviceable ones are being taken out, and now a whole load more. The battlefield today is run by intelligence. We're hearing initiatives around the SDR about intelligence. You take out some crucial nodes of that. In other words, you make yourself blind. That's quite tricky. And it's not something you can't nip down to Waitrose and, can I order another one of those, please? I don't know how long they take to build, but it's not measured in months. It's not even single years, is it?
Yeah, and there is no production line for these aircraft, so you've got to stand the whole thing up from scratch. And even if they could do that, that's going to divert effort from other systems. So it's going to bite, whether it bites in the short term, the medium, or the long term. Probably all 3. I think if I was Ukraine and I could have done this, I would have done it. There's a lot of people could say, "Oh, you're about to enter peace talks. Why would you do such a thing?" Because you want to walk in those peace talks, looking across that table, going, "We've got you." And I could go on. I'd rather be on the Ukrainian side on that table today.
No, and there was a lovely point, wasn't it? They said, surely they're undermining peace talks. You went, right, hang on a second. The last peace talks, nobody credible turned up from the Russian side. There is no evident appetite for peace. This is all a bit stage managed. And therefore, at the moment, Ukraine goes into those talks, or has been, as the underdog. Now, all of a sudden, it's got a point of influence. I guess there's a couple of questions that it does throw up, one of which is President Putin must be hacked off. He must be furious about this, because this isn't just a tactical thing. It's about Russia's standing in the world and its ability to influence. What do you think the sorts of things he might get up to now? There's talks about ballistic missiles being launched. There's talk about all sorts of options. You say that he's already got the gloves off, but he'll want to do something more, won't he?
Yeah, well, yes is probably the answer. My first answer to your question is, if you're anybody in Russia right now responsible for the protection of airfields, do not walk past an open window, anything above the second floor. He might try and downplay this. That's what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing Russia saying this is not a big event. In fact, they've called it a terrorist attack. It's a clandestine attack. That's not a terrorist attack. This is self-defense against assets that have been used to strike civilian targets in Ukraine. It is entirely legitimate. And if Russia didn't think it was liable to that attack, then quite frankly, they're more stupid than we thought they were. But you're right. He might feel this so badly that they'll be thinking now about what their reaction is, what the retaliation is. I wonder how it will affect peace talks. I think the fact that Russia are still at those peace talks, maybe that indicates that they're not ready to entirely disengage, because that could have been the reaction. They could have literally refused to turn up and said, right, well, clearly Ukraine doesn't want peace. That's the end of the talks. So, I wonder if Russia actually even does know how to handle this. Normally, Putin's very clever.
I guess that was my question, really, is that you've got this conundrum where our theory is that Putin is not remotely interested in peace, but he knows that Donald Trump might be unpredictable if he doesn't at least make overtures that he's interested. You'd naturally expect the peace talks to have been cancelled as a result of this sort of attack. And you sort of wonder whether actually is Putin getting in a bit of a corner here, because he he wants to just walk away from them, but he also knows Trump's unpredictable. And if he does walk away, President Trump has said that in the next week to 2 weeks' time, it'll be evident whether Russia is remotely interested in peace or not. If he was to walk away, that might unleash the dogs of war from America, and actually make life really difficult. So I think for me, I'm not quite sure as Ukraine is in the fight as some of the media organizations are saying, but it's definitely swung the balance a little bit more in Ukraine's favor when it comes to, the current situation, particularly relations with America.
Yeah, I agree. I think Russia is scrabbling right now. I think Putin is going, what the hell just happened? The fact that nobody knew, America didn't know. I mean, that is a major coup for Ukraine to have achieved something so dramatic and yet have kept it under wraps for obvious reasons is nothing short of a coup. But on balance, you saw the sands shifting slightly in Ukraine's favor over the last few weeks anyway. Notwithstanding Trump's on the bus, off the bus, you were seeing Congress starting to talk about serious sanctions again because Russia wasn't playing ball. So Russia was always slightly on the naughty step here. What this has done, I think, on balance, is it's demonstrated to America that Ukraine is not out. We do not need to sue for peace on Ukraine's behalf because Ukraine is holding its own. And it shows. And I think this is where Putin is really going to struggle here. This shows huge weakness for Russia, huge weakness. To have taken this hit, it demonstrates a nation that's not on top of the game here.
So I guess my final area of this was just that the SDR is being released today. It is a more dangerous world. I'm just wondering what lessons we draw from this, because over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the fact that ever since the Cold War, which is all about redundancy and dispersion, survivability, now it's all about efficiency. We've consolidated, all our fighters are on one base, all our transport aircraft are on one base. And these sorts of attacks just demonstrate how vulnerable we are. What sort of lessons do you think this event shows for ourselves in terms of what we might be looking to invest in? How do we protect ourselves? How do we maintain that level of credible deterrence, given that these little drones were probably no more than $1,000 each and there were lots of them? How on earth do you defend yourself against that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have written in the last 24 hours, this is changing the rules of the game. It's completely a new paradigm. Of course, it's not. In fact, you don't have to go that far back for when we last experienced this. So if you remember, I can't remember the date, but Bastion Airport in Helmand province was attacked by the Taliban, who came through the wire and started blowing up Harriers, Marine Corps Harriers, as it turned out, with the RAF regiment, defending the airbase. So we've learned these lessons rather recently, but there were lessons that we applied in the Cold War, Sean. You and I remember this. When we kept our airplanes locked up in hardened shelters, not just because that meant they were protected from bombs coming from the air, but were also protected from little green men running around the airbase with hand grenades and machine guns that could have caused all sorts of harm. So protecting your assets and doing force protection the old-fashioned way is as important sometimes as the high-tech defense that you're putting up once you get them airborne. I know we get accused a little bit of getting our lamps and our beers out and talking about what it was like in the good old days, but those lessons have been there for a long time. So camouflage, protection, dispersion, hardening, force protection, all the things that we've saved money on because that wasn't the threat for the last 20, 30 years, although as we proved in Bastion, it was. And we've put all our eggs on very few numbers of baskets. Now, I think the Air Force is reacting to this in the UK. There's a thing called the Agile Combat Employment, which I know frightens people with the jargon, but it's the whole concept of going back to dispersal and force protection and using other air bases or using motorway strips, whatever it might be, so that you can't, take out an entire 34% or whatever of your assets in one fell swoop. But this isn't just about aeroplanes and airfields. Ports, harbours, electrical service stations around Heathrow. I'm not sure that's been proven, but you only have to take out a little bit of our critical national infrastructure before it really starts to have an impact. Not just on the military, but on the nation.
Yeah, and I don't think there is a bit of scaremongering about all this at the moment, isn't there? But I do think, going back to your point, I think philosophically, that's the mindset is that, we've got to shift away now from this efficiencies. Redundancy costs money, dispersal costs money, having spare capacity costs money. But actually, and that's where I'm just not entirely sure at the moment when we're looking to spend 2.5%, which is up from 2.3%, but in reality is actually flatlining or slightly lower in reality, how much money is available. And yet, philosophically, the approach we take to defence has to change, and that will inevitably cost more money. And I think it's a really profound lesson, not about the drones per se, but about the vulnerability. There is an argument that Ukraine herded the Russian assets away from their own bases because they were too vulnerable there, herded them away to somewhere 1,000, 1,500 miles away where there wasn't the protection available, and then were able to conduct a surprise attack when these aircraft were in the open.
Yeah.
Just got to be a bit smart about this sort of stuff.
I mean, we're recording this before the defence review comes out, although the odd bit's been trailed over the news. I mean, in some ways, this plays to the argument about this so-called Home Guard reserve and national awareness, because if the threat is cruise missiles, that's one thing. But if the other threat is drones being fired out of shipping containers, then who's going to be vigilant and be looking out for shipping containers or strange activity? And I think there is a lot in that if things begin to escalate, how do we as a nation put ourselves in a resilient mindset? I don't want to use the word war footing, because the idea that we're literally all getting rifles out and patrolling our local neighborhood, but how do you create the mindset that starts to think about these types of threats and is on the lookout for them and can detect them before they do what they do? It is a mindset change, but we need to think long and hard about that, because that's how Russia fights, and we need to be ready for it.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things I've just come back from a defence conference out in Prague, and just a little vignette that talks to this point. Several of my army colleagues are dead against conscription because it basically undermines the operational effectiveness of your military. You spend ages training people for them to spend a couple of years in and then leave. They're not as well motivated and therefore the British Army is dead against conscription. I was speaking to a very senior former army officer from our military. He said within a year of leaving, he became absolutely compelled that conscription was the right answer. And he said because he only saw it through a straight military lens, but he said at the moment, our nation expects the military to deal with defence without really having an empathy and understanding how it's a Team UK enterprise, that we all need to be more resilient. And he said the more people that have spent time in the military, understand the military psyche, feel that they are actually part of that enterprise, they're not just paying a premium for somebody else to do it for them, is something that we have to do in the future. And he said that there's a lot of countries around the world, Israel, Finland, that have a very successful model that the country recognizes they need to spend more money. When it becomes welfare or warfare, they go, yeah, but if we don't spend the money, we don't have the deterrence. If we don't have the deterrence, we risk being attacked, and therefore we'll have to go and fight. Nobody wants that. Therefore, there's a much greater national understanding. And I think it talks to, this isn't just about the military. This is about our nation buying into it, not only the funding of it, but our individual role in making sure the country is secure.
Yeah, you made such a good point. I mean, if you look at the mindset of countries like Finland and Israel, classic examples, but even countries like Switzerland, where everyone has been through some form of national training, most of them have got a rifle under the bed at home, ready to roll. It's a complete mindset change. Now, we, of course, live on our little island, safe, fat, dumb and happy, don't we? Well, just remind everyone that these drones came on shipping containers.
Good point to end.